Lucas Bennett thought he knew everything about Grace Moore, until the day he saw her at the grocery store with two small children calling her Mom. They had her eyes, her laugh, and a past she never told him about. In that moment, everything he believed about their quiet, growing connection shattered, and something far more complicated, and far more real, began. Lucas Bennett was used to walking into a room and having the air shift around him. People noticed him, his name, his money, his presence, and responded with either awe or calculation. That was the world he'd grown up in, and the world he had mastered. But nothing about Grace Moore fit that pattern. She didn't look at him with flattery or suspicion. She barely looked at him at all. He first saw her at a creative pitch meeting, sitting at the far end of a long table, her laptop open, her notes neat, her voice calm and clear. She wasn't flashy. She wasn't trying to stand out. But when she spoke, everyone listened, even him. There was a quiet strength in her, the kind that didn't need a stage. Lucas had come to the small marketing agency unannounced, partly out of boredom and partly out of curiosity. His company had invested in one of their digital products, and he wanted to see the operation for himself. He didn't expect to stay more than 20 minutes. He stayed over an hour. Not because of the numbers or the presentation, but because of her. After the meeting, he lingered longer than he usually did, chatting with the creative director and throwing in a few casual questions about the team. Grace's name came up. She wasn't new, but she wasn't one of the loud ones either. A quiet engine, someone said. Solid. Reliable. The next day, he came back, using a vague excuse about wanting to see another round of campaign concepts. She was surprised but didn't ask why. She offered coffee. He declined. But he stayed, sat in on a brainstorm session, and watched her work. There was something in the way she handled pressure, how she navigated disagreements without ego. It fascinated him more than he liked to admit. And slowly, almost cautiously, he found ways to insert himself into her routine, a shared walk to the elevator, a comment on her color choices, a coffee brought to her desk with the excuse of trying a new place. She never flirted. She never tried to impress. And somehow, that was exactly what drew him in. In a world full of people trying to prove something, Grace didn't ask for attention. She simply was. He found himself looking for her even when he came to the agency for other reasons. He started asking her questions, not about work, but about music, books, cities she liked. She was careful at first, answering politely but keeping a gentle distance. He could tell she didn't fully trust his interest. Maybe she thought it was temporary. Maybe she'd seen enough of men like him to know they didn't stay. But he did. Slowly, deliberately, he stayed. He didn't ask her out. He didn't make a move. He just kept showing up, listening more than speaking, offering presence instead of pressure. And over time, she softened. She started smiling at his dry jokes. She asked him questions back. They began meeting outside of work, walks, quiet dinners, conversations that stretched into the evening. He found himself telling her things he rarely shared. About the coldness of boardrooms, the weight of inherited wealth, the loneliness that lived between the lines of success. And she listened, not with pity or fascination, but with quiet understanding. He didn't ask about her family. She never brought it up. And he assumed, wrongly, that there was none. He saw how she lived, independent, composed, private, and imagined that her life was as straightforward as it appeared. No ring. No photos on her desk. No mentions of children. He thought she was like him, someone who had learned to build a life around solitude and protect it fiercely. And so, without knowing it, Lucas fell for a woman whose truth was far more complex than the version she let him see. And that truth was about to change everything. It was a quiet Thursday afternoon when everything shifted. Lucas had just finished a last-minute meeting with a potential investor and decided to stop by a small grocery store near his apartment, a place he rarely visited but had passed 100 times. He needed coffee and a moment of normal. The boardroom had drained him, and something about being in a space where no one knew his name felt oddly comforting. He moved through the aisles slowly, without his usual sense of urgency, appreciating the lack of pretense in the narrow shelves and quiet fluorescent lights. He turned a corner near the checkout line and stopped mid-step. Grace was there. She was facing away from him, her hair pulled up in a loose bun, wearing jeans and a soft-looking sweater, nothing like the polished version of herself he was used to seeing at the office. She looked completely at ease, leaning down to talk to two children, twins, a boy and a girl, who stood close to her side. They couldn't have been older than 4. The boy was holding a box of cereal, and the girl clutched a small stuffed animal. They had reddish curls, fair skin, and something about their eyes made Lucas's stomach twist. "Mama," the girl said, tugging gently on Grace's sleeve, "can we get the purple yogurt too?" Lucas felt his breath catch. It wasn't just the word. It was how easily the girl said it, how naturally she fit into Grace's world. He stood frozen, hidden partly by a display of canned soup, watching a version of Grace he had never seen, gentle, maternal, completely consumed by her children. He had seen her focused and quiet, intelligent and strong, but never like this. Never as someone's mother. His first reaction was confusion. Then something closer to shock. Not because she had children, but because she had never told him. Not once. He thought back to every conversation they'd had, every dinner, every walk, every long and meaningful silence. Had she lied? Had she simply omitted something so enormous? And if she had, what else hadn't she said? He backed away before she saw him. The idea of confronting her there, in the middle of a grocery store, with 2 small children beside her, felt invasive. He left his cart where it was and walked straight out into the cool afternoon air, barely noticing the breeze or the sunlight. His thoughts were loud and tangled. He didn't know what to do with the mixture of disappointment, hurt, and confusion swirling in his chest. Back in his apartment, he sat on the edge of his bed, phone in hand, but didn't call her. He wanted to demand an explanation. He also didn't want to speak to her at all. He felt foolish for how much he had let himself care, for how sure he'd been that he knew who she was. He tried to tell himself it didn't matter. That she had every right to keep parts of her life private. That she owed him nothing. But deep down, he knew the truth, he was already in too deep. That night, he didn't sleep. He thought about the way the boy looked at her, the way the girl leaned against her leg, the way Grace had smiled, open, unguarded, in a way she never had around him. And it hurt, not because of what she had, but because of what she hadn't shared. He had started building something with her, slowly and with care, believing it was mutual, believing she trusted him. And now he wasn't sure whether any of it had been real. By the next morning, Lucas had disappeared from her world. No messages. No emails. No calls. He vanished, not out of cruelty, but because he didn't know how to process the storm of emotions inside him. And Grace, unaware of what he had seen, was left to wonder why the man who had slowly become a part of her everyday life had suddenly chosen to become a stranger again. For the first few days after Lucas vanished, Grace told herself he was just busy. His schedule had always been unpredictable, filled with late meetings and sudden flights to different cities. She didn't want to jump to conclusions, especially since everything between them had been unfolding at its own quiet, careful pace. She didn't panic. She simply waited, trying not to let her thoughts spiral. But as days stretched into a week and then into 10 long, silent mornings, something inside her began to fray. The text messages she sent remained unread. Calls went straight to voicemail. There was no explanation, no warning, just an abrupt and total absence that gnawed at her. She tried to stay composed, especially around the twins. They were used to her being steady. It was a part of the world she had built for them, predictable, calm, and safe. They had no idea what had changed. They didn't ask about Lucas because they had never met him. She had kept that part of her life completely separate, partly out of protection and partly out of fear. Fear that he would run the moment he saw the full truth. And now, it seemed, he had. She didn't know he had seen her in the store. That he had seen the children. That the moment she had been dreading, the secret she had hoped to ease him into when the time was right, had crashed over both of them without warning. She only knew that something had gone wrong. And the silence was starting to feel louder than anything he could have said. At night, when the kids were asleep, she would sit at the kitchen table with a cup of tea she never finished. The house would be quiet, too quiet, and her thoughts would pull her back to every conversation they'd had. She wondered if she had misread him completely. She thought of how he had listened to her like no one else, how he had opened up about things most men in his position would never admit to. She remembered how she had started to imagine introducing him to her children, how she had pictured him standing in the kitchen with them, laughing, maybe even staying. But she hadn't told him. And maybe that had been her mistake. Maybe by trying to protect something fragile, she had lost the chance to share it at all. Lucas, meanwhile, was spinning in his own version of the silence. He stayed away not out of anger, but out of hurt. His mind was caught in a loop, replaying the image of Grace smiling at her children, the shock of realizing she had kept something so monumental from him, and the weight of not knowing why. He had always seen himself as someone hard to surprise, hard to move. But Grace had moved him from the beginning. And that was what made the truth sting so much. Because he had let his guard down, and she hadn't trusted him with her whole truth. But underneath the disappointment, there was something else. Guilt. Because the more he thought about it, the more he realized he had never asked. He had assumed. He had built a picture of her based on what he wanted her to be, free, unattached, uncomplicated. He hadn't left room in that vision for anything real or messy or rooted in the kind of history that changes everything. And now, with that illusion broken, he didn't know what to do. He felt betrayed, yes. But more than that, he felt ashamed of his own expectations. Still, he did nothing. Said nothing. While Grace waited for a word, a gesture, anything to make sense of his absence, Lucas remained silent. Not because he didn't care, but because he cared too much and had no idea how to step forward without falling into everything he'd spent his life avoiding: vulnerability, uncertainty, the uncontrollable depth of real connection. And so, two people who had come so close to something rare drifted quietly apart, each holding pieces of a truth too heavy to carry alone. It was raining the day Lucas showed up at her door, the kind of steady, unapologetic rain that soaked the sidewalks and quieted the world. Grace wasn't expecting anyone. She had just finished putting the twins down for their nap, their soft breathing still echoing faintly through the baby monitor on the kitchen counter. She was barefoot, dressed in an old sweatshirt, a mug of lukewarm coffee in hand when the knock came. Her first thought was that it might be a neighbor, maybe someone delivering a package. But when she opened the door and saw him standing there, soaked, tired, silent, everything inside her froze. Lucas didn't say anything right away. His eyes searched hers, not with judgment but with something deeper, something wounded and hesitant. He looked different. Not in the obvious ways. Still perfectly dressed, though his shirt clung to his skin and his hair was wet from the rain. But there was something in his expression, rawness, humility, a kind of vulnerability she had never seen in him before. She stepped aside without a word, letting him in. The house was warm and quiet. Toys were tucked into baskets, a few children's books stacked neatly on the coffee table. It wasn't a grand space, but it felt lived in and loved. Lucas glanced around as if taking it all in for the first time, which, in a way, he was. He had never seen this side of her life. And now he was standing in the middle of it. Grace didn't offer him a towel or ask if he wanted tea. She just stood there, arms crossed, waiting. Waiting for him to speak. Waiting to understand why, after so much silence, he was suddenly here. "I saw you," he said finally. His voice was low, thick with everything unsaid. "At the grocery store. With them." She didn't flinch. She didn't pretend. She simply nodded. I figured. He looked at her again, harder this time. You never told me. I know. Why? She let out a slow breath, her voice steady even as her fingers tightened around her arms. Because I didn't know how. Because I didn't want you to look at me the way you're looking at me now. Like you don't know who I am. Lucas turned away for a moment, running a hand through his wet hair. He paced once across the living room, then stopped. I didn't know how to process it. I didn't know what to do with the fact that the woman I was falling for had a whole life I didn't know about. She stepped forward, her voice quiet but firm. I wasn't hiding them because I was ashamed. I was protecting them. And maybe I was protecting myself too. Every man I've ever met saw them as baggage, as a complication. And I didn't want to watch that flicker in your eyes. So I waited. I waited for the right moment. But there never is one, is there? He didn't answer right away. He looked at her with a mixture of regret and something else, something beginning to soften. You should have told me, Grace. I know, she said again. And you should have stayed. That silenced him. They stood there, two people who had been circling around the truth for too long, finally stripped of everything but honesty. It wasn't dramatic. There were no raised voices, no tears. Just pain shared in equal measure. I don't want you to think I lied to you, she said softly. I just didn't trust you not to run. I did run. I know. They stared at each other, and in the silence, something shifted. Not forgiveness, not yet. But understanding. Lucas stepped forward, slowly, like he was afraid of breaking something fragile between them. I'm here now, he said. I don't know what that means yet. I don't even know if I deserve to be here. But I needed you to hear that. I needed to say it to your face, not through a message or in a moment that could be misunderstood. Grace looked at him, really looked, and saw not the man who had disappeared, but the man who came back. She nodded once and stepped aside again. This time, when he walked further into her home, she didn't stop him. Lucas returned the next day. He didn't ask if he could come. He simply appeared, standing at her doorstep with a cautious expression and a bag of pastries he picked up from the bakery down the street. Grace opened the door in surprise, but not shock. Something about his presence, while still unfamiliar in her home, was beginning to settle like a piece that had always been missing but never noticed until now. She hesitated, then stepped back again, allowing him in. The twins were in the living room, sprawled across the rug with crayons and construction paper, absorbed in their imaginary world. The moment they looked up and saw him, they paused, curious, but not afraid. They didn't know him, but he didn't feel like a stranger. Lucas didn't try to talk to them immediately. He placed the bag of pastries on the kitchen counter and joined Grace at the table. She watched him cautiously, unsure of what he expected or what she was supposed to say. But he didn't ask for explanations this time. He didn't press her with questions or demand answers. Instead, he talked about something simple, his week, a deal that nearly collapsed, a book he read on the flight home. It was strange, hearing him speak so normally while sitting in the middle of a space filled with children's drawings and half-folded laundry. And yet, it made sense in a way that startled her. He stayed for an hour. Then he left. The next day, he came again. This time, he brought a children's book. He sat on the floor and read to the twins, his voice uneven at first, too stiff, too formal. But when Mia giggled and corrected him on a word, he relaxed. Grace stood in the hallway, listening, watching, her heart uncertain but beginning to thaw. Lucas didn't push. He didn't ask to be included. He simply showed up. Again and again. Quietly. Gently. Patiently. The twins started to ask about him. At first, it was small, questions like, is he coming back, or, does he know how to draw horses? Then they began waiting by the window when it got close to 5 o'clock. They would rush to the door when they heard a knock, not because they were told to, but because they wanted to. Lucas never came empty-handed, but it wasn't about the gifts. It was about his consistency. He remembered what their favorite juice was. He remembered the name of Mia's stuffed bunny and the way Leo liked his sandwich cut. He learned the rhythm of their world and stepped into it without trying to change the tempo. Grace started to see him differently. Not as the man who had walked away, but as the one who chose to come back, not out of guilt, but because he wanted to. She still had doubts. She still held back. But her heart was no longer closed. One evening, after the kids had gone to sleep and the house was quiet again, she poured him a cup of tea without asking. They sat at the kitchen table in silence for a long time. He didn't reach for her hand. He didn't ask about their future. He simply sat there, present, allowing space for the quiet to exist without pressure. When he stood to leave that night, he looked at her and said, "I'm not expecting you to trust me overnight. I know what I did, and I know what I didn't do. But I'm here now. Not because I have to be. Because I want to be. Even if that means just being on the outside until you're ready to let me in." Grace didn't answer. But she walked him to the door and didn't close it until he was gone from sight. That was the night she started to believe that maybe he meant it. Not in words. But in presence. By the time a month had passed, Lucas had become a quiet fixture in their lives. He never assumed, never overstepped, but his presence became something the twins looked forward to and something Grace couldn't ignore. Every visit was a step, every storytime a thread slowly weaving him into the fabric of their world. The children had grown used to his calm, steady energy, and they treated him as part of their routine. When he wasn't there, they asked when he would be. When he was, they pulled him into their games without hesitation, as though he had always been meant to fill that space beside them. He still called himself Lucas when he spoke to them, never trying to force a role, but something had shifted. They no longer saw him as a visitor. They saw him as someone who stayed. Grace remained careful, but even she couldn't deny what was happening. Her walls, built so carefully over the years, had cracks now. He had earned them. Not through dramatic gestures, but through patience and presence. He never pressured her for more than she could give. He never brought up the future unless she opened the door. He simply showed up, again and again, with steady hands and an open heart. It terrified her. Because she had once believed love like this didn't exist, at least not for her. She was a mother. She was complicated. Her life was full of responsibility, of routines, of messes and tiny socks and bedtime meltdowns. But somehow, Lucas didn't seem overwhelmed by any of it. He didn't try to fix her life. He just stepped into it with quiet respect. One night, Grace found herself standing outside on the porch long after the kids had gone to bed. She didn't hear him approach at first. He had stayed late helping Leo build a cardboard rocket ship, and when she turned around, he was at the doorway, leaning against the frame, watching her with a softness that made her chest ache. She didn't speak. Neither did he. For several minutes, they just stood there, side by side, the quiet between them almost as intimate as a touch. Finally, she glanced at him, and in a voice so low it barely rose above the sound of the night, she said, "I didn't think someone like you would want something like this." He didn't ask what she meant. He knew. The chaos, the unpredictability, the responsibility of raising children that weren't biologically his. The truth she had kept hidden for so long out of fear that once he saw all of her, past, present, and future, he would walk away. But he didn't. "I didn't think I would either," he said honestly. "Until you." She turned her eyes toward the sky, blinking against the tears she didn't want to shed. "They love you, you know. Even if they don't say it yet." "I know," he said. "And I love them back." The words weren't rushed. They weren't performative. They were steady and sure, like everything else he had been since the moment he returned. Grace swallowed hard, her heart thudding painfully in her chest. She had wanted to keep her guard up longer. She had promised herself that she would protect her children from anything uncertain. But Lucas didn't feel uncertain anymore. He felt real. She looked at him, truly looked, and saw not a billionaire, not the man who had once disappeared, but the man who had shown up every single day since. She took a breath and stepped closer, her voice barely audible. "I don't know what this is going to be." "Neither do I," he said. "But I want to find out." She nodded, and without thinking, without planning it or fearing the consequences, she reached for his hand. He didn't flinch. He simply wrapped his fingers around hers, warm and steady, and they stood there beneath the soft porch light, no longer strangers to each other's truths. Inside the house, the night was quiet. The cardboard rocket sat half-finished on the living room floor. The twins slept soundly. And out on the porch, something else had finally settled too. Not a conclusion, but a beginning. The following weeks unfolded with a quiet rhythm that neither Grace nor Lucas dared to interrupt. There were no dramatic declarations, no sudden changes in title or routine, but something between them had undeniably shifted. They had crossed an invisible threshold that made things feel more real, more fragile, and more beautiful all at once. Lucas began spending more time at the house, not just in the evenings, but in the in-between hours, helping with lunch on weekends, folding tiny clothes without being asked, fixing the wobbly chair at the dining table, and learning how to braid Mia's hair with a level of concentration that made the twins giggle uncontrollably. Grace watched these moments quietly, the way he slipped into their life without turning it upside down. It was almost like he had always belonged there. The twins started calling him Luca in their soft, mispronounced voices. It made him smile every time. He never corrected them. One morning, Leo, unprompted and still half asleep, climbed into Lucas's lap and rested his head on his chest while Grace made breakfast. Lucas froze for a second, caught off guard by the weight of the little boy against him, the trust in that tiny body. He looked up at Grace, and she just nodded gently, giving him permission to lean into it. So he did. From that moment on, something changed for him too. He had always felt the tug toward the twins, the growing attachment he tried to keep under control, but now it was deeper. He wasn't watching them anymore from a place of admiration or guilt or wonder. He was loving them, entirely, instinctively, and without fear. One evening, after putting the kids to bed, Lucas and Grace sat on the couch, the soft hum of cartoons still playing low from the other room. She had her legs tucked under her, and he was stretched beside her, close but not touching. They talked about nothing at first, work, errands, a funny thing Mia had said. But then Grace went quiet, her fingers brushing over the seam of a cushion. "They asked about their father today," she said suddenly. Lucas sat up slightly, giving her his full attention. "I've always told them the truth," she continued. "That he wasn't ready. That it wasn't their fault. I never wanted them to feel abandoned, but I didn't want to lie either. And now I'm not sure what I'm supposed to say, because they have you." Lucas didn't speak right away. He knew how important this moment was, not just for her, but for everything they were building. When he finally answered, his voice was calm, sure. "You don't have to erase him to make space for me. I'm not trying to rewrite their history. I'm just trying to be a part of their future." She looked at him then, eyes filled with something raw and vulnerable. "Do you mean that? I wouldn't be here if I didn't." Her gaze dropped to her hands, and when she looked back up, there was a tear sliding down her cheek. "You're already their father in every way that counts." Lucas reached for her hand and held it tightly. "Then let's make that real." She blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" "I want to be in their lives officially. I want to take that step. Legally. Permanently." Grace was silent. It wasn't hesitation she felt, it was overwhelm. She had never imagined a world where someone would ask to claim her children, not out of obligation, but out of love. She searched his face for any sign of doubt, but there was none. Just quiet determination. You're serious, she whispered. I am. I've never been more serious. The silence that followed was not filled with fear, but with something sacred. Grace nodded slowly, emotion choking her voice. Okay, she said. Let's do it. And in that simple exchange, everything changed. Not with grand fanfare, but with the steady pulse of something true. They weren't two separate lives anymore. They were becoming a family. Not because they were perfect. Not because they had planned for it. But because they had chosen each other, again and again, even when it was hard. And now, they were ready to make it real. The day of the hearing arrived quietly, without the noise or spectacle Lucas had grown used to in his corporate life. There were no reporters, no public statements, no suits in glass towers. Just a modest family courtroom, early morning light filtering through high windows, and the sound of crayons scratching paper as Mia and Leo colored at a small table in the corner. Grace sat beside Lucas, holding his hand in both of hers, her grip tight and nervous, though her expression remained composed. She had dressed simply, but beautifully, her hair pulled back and her eyes steady. Lucas had seen her brave before, but never like this. Today wasn't about her career or defending herself. Today was about trusting someone else with the most precious pieces of her life. The judge was kind and curious, asking a series of questions that Lucas answered without hesitation. He spoke plainly about his intentions, about how long he had been involved, about the nature of his relationship with the twins and with Grace. He didn't embellish. He didn't make promises he couldn't keep. He simply told the truth, that he loved them, that he had chosen them, and that he would continue choosing them every day. At one point, the judge glanced toward the children, who were now standing quietly beside Grace. He asked Leo what Lucas meant to him, and the little boy didn't hesitate. He said, "He's the one who stays." That answer landed like a stone in the center of the room, soft, but impossible to ignore. Grace's eyes filled, and Lucas felt something in his chest shift permanently. It wasn't about titles or legal forms. It was about what they had built, day by day, minute by minute, in living rooms and bedtime routines and moments of presence that had no name until now. When the judge granted the request for legal guardianship, there was no applause. Just silence, deep and full, followed by a single sentence, "Mr. Bennett, as of today, you are legally recognized as the father of Mia and Leo." The words echoed in Lucas's mind long after they were spoken, not because they changed everything, but because they affirmed what had already been true for a long time. Later that afternoon, back at home, the five of them sat on the floor of the living room surrounded by takeout boxes and crumpled napkins. The twins were too young to fully understand what had happened, but they knew something good had occurred. They kept hugging him at random moments, as if sensing he was now even more theirs than before. Grace watched them with a look Lucas would never forget, one of quiet awe, as though she was still trying to believe it wasn't a dream. He reached across the floor and took her hand. "We did it," he said softly. "No," she corrected with a smile. "You did it." That evening, after the twins were asleep and the house had gone still, Grace pulled something from the drawer of her nightstand. It was a small black box, simple and elegant. Lucas raised an eyebrow, but she just handed it to him. Inside was a silver band, engraved on the inside with one word, "Ours." "I was going to wait until next week," she said, "but tonight feels right." Lucas looked up at her, eyes wide. "You want to?" "Yes," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "I want to marry the man who didn't run. I want to marry the man who stayed." There were no elaborate speeches. No stage, no crowd. Just the two of them, wrapped in a moment that belonged only to them. He slipped the ring onto his finger. "I didn't think I would ever have this," he whispered. Grace stepped closer, her forehead resting against his. "Neither did I. But we built it anyway." And they did. Not perfectly. Not quickly. But fully. With each truth faced, each fear overcome, each act of staying when it would have been easier to walk away, they had built a family. Not by accident, but by choice. And in the quiet stillness of that night, with 2 children sleeping down the hall and a future finally beginning, Lucas realized that everything he once believed made him powerful meant nothing compared to what he held now. A home. A family. A love that had endured the hardest parts and still stood strong. The kind of love that doesn't need to be earned with words, but with presence, every single day. What makes the ending of this story resonate so deeply for me is that it's not about perfection, it's about presence. Lucas doesn't sweep in to fix anything. He doesn't try to replace the past or erase the pain. He shows up and stays, day after day, choosing love not as a grand gesture but as a quiet, consistent decision. That's what makes it powerful. He goes from a man who walked away out of fear to someone who rebuilds trust not with promises, but with actions. Grace's arc is just as moving. She doesn't fall into love easily or forgive without caution. She protects her children, guards her heart, and only opens herself to Lucas again when she sees that he truly understands what it means to stay. She lets herself be loved not because she's convinced it's safe, but because she sees that it's real, and that's even braver. This story is about building something lasting out of broken parts. It's about love that doesn't ignore the hard parts but grows through them. And by the time they reach the end, it's not a return to what could have been, it's the beginning of something even better, something earned. That's the kind of ending that lingers.